Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the removal of squatters, trespassers and protesters hosted by High Court Enforcement Group. First things first, in the question box that you should see on your screen, can you let me know if you can all hear me properly? Well, most of you can hear me, that's good news. The second thing is, if there is more than one of you in the room, can you let me know how many of you there are? Again, with the questions, there's a questions box there, so feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll be answering them at the end, but yeah, feel free to write them out throughout, and that's the correct place to do so. This webinar is also worth one CPD point. There are 2 quizzes throughout which do require your participation. We do see if you participate, and with Christmas only 63 days away, you don't want to be on the naughty list, so I suggest you get involved. Moving swiftly on, you can see the technical tool there in front of you, shows everything you need to use. It's relatively self-explanatory. We do have a disclaimer, so please do treat the contents of this webinar as food for thought. We don't take any action based on its contents unless you have taken legal advice. The speakers cannot accept responsibility for any errors or inaccuracies, loss or damage unless we have given you personally specific advice relating to a matter about which you have given us full background details. You must also bear in mind that the contents of this webinar are based on English law, and because it contains archival material, the material is bound to go out of date. The aims of today's webinar are to provide sufficient understanding to landlords and landowners of how to evict squatters, trespassers, activists or protesters from property and land, to consider what practical and regulatory matters will affect regaining vacant possession and plan how to deal with such issues that arise, to consider, predict and mitigate commercial and reputational risks, and finally to understand what compliance and service standards your chosen HCEO as High Court Enforcement Officer should demonstrate and deliver. Introducing who I have with me today, I'm kindly joined by the Business Development Manager, Martin Spears, who's travelled up from Cardiff this morning. Martin joined the group in 2017. He's recently attained his level 2 in taking control of goods. He has vast experience across all sorts of businesses and business development and has worked closely with the national eviction team on several high-profile cases. Hello, Martin.
Hello there.
And then our other lovely speaker from the same sort of area of the country, we have Mr. Alan Morgan. Alan joined the group in 2007 with the national eviction team. He also has his level 2 in taking control of goods. He has level 3 in vulnerability and mental health awareness in reaction to enforcement practices. And you can also see some of his roles and responsibilities that he has partaken since joining the group. Both of our speakers' profiles are readily available online. If you want to know more about them, their details will also be there at the end, so feel free to get in touch with them. At this point, I will kindly hand over to the 2 gentlemen. Oh, no, I won't. I'll briefly say what we're covering that would help. Trespassers, squatters and protesters, the law, options for removal, process, regulatory compliance and regulatory matters, post-eviction considerations, and then at the end we will then have any questions. We will split this up in 2 parts where there will be a quiz at the end of each of them, as previously mentioned. Take it away, fellas.
So the most common type of trespassers are travellers. This year, our Commercial Services Department has seen a massive increase in traveller and trespasser cases. This has been both on privately owned and local authority land throughout England and Wales. When removing trespassers and travellers, High Court Enforcement believe the speed is essential to reduce the risk of further trespassers arriving on site and to minimise the likelihood of further damage to your property and land. This also cuts down on the escalating costs from fly tipping. Squatters generally occupy unused commercial property. What are squatters? A squatter is someone who deliberately enters a property without permission and lives there or intends to live there. This is also sometimes known as adverse possession. Squatting in a non-residential building is not in itself a crime, but it is a crime to damage the property. If you or your client are unlucky enough to have squatters occupy your commercial property, you will need to remove them under a court order. The easiest way to start this process is using a possession claim online or gain an order for possession through your local county court.
Okay, moving on to protesters. These could be made up of activists, anti-capitalists, as we've seen over the last few years, or environmental protesters, as has been in the press and on the TV this week. So we'll often see them at sort of fracking sites, various demonstrations, infrastructure projects, and quite often you'll see them initially setting up perhaps a small camp, which may develop into a rather larger camp with possibly 40, 50, 60 protesters living there. Sometimes they'll actually be there full time, and sometimes they'll be there part time with supporters coming along to feed them and to water them.
So the law on trespassers. The law enables the removal of trespassers through two main remedies. One's a court order for possession, and the other option is the common law using self-help or Halsbury law.
Just to make a little point there, Martin, there are other remedies available, but we're not actually going to cover them in any depth today. Some of you may say that sort of the Highways Act is also an appropriate remedy, and absolutely it is. But we are going to focus on just the orders of possession and the common law Halsbury's today.
Yeah, it's an interesting point there. But the government guidance suggests the local authorities seek a court order to regain possession of land.
That's one quick point around that as well. That is absolutely spot on. But this year we have seen a trend with some local authorities who have used Halsbury's law of common law to remove the travellers, especially because they've seen it as a quicker remedy. Although it's not as guaranteed with the outcome, sometimes it can actually be a cheaper and efficient remedy as well.
Yeah, yeah. You can obtain a court order, a county court order, and transfer it to the High Court for a writ of possession, which will then be enforced by a High Court officer. But we'll actually go through this protest in more detail in a few slides' time.
Okay, so the law, trespass and common law, known as Halsbury's law. You can see there where it actually comes from. What does it actually say? Well, the words there make up the actual law itself, and the key elements there is that the person who is the landowner has the right to ask any trespasser to leave using reasonable force. So a couple of points there. He has the right to ask that person to leave, and secondly, he has the right to use reasonable force. Reasonable force is open to debate, but quite simply, if you are seen to be conversational, not aggressive, and taking the necessary physical action to physically remove a protester or a trespasser, then that would generally fall within the reasonably test, or the reasonable test, I should say. However, one aspect with common law, it cannot be used if the trespassers are actually living or residing in a permanent or a semi-permanent structure. So the key there is it can be used on land, but not on a structure. And the other big aspect of common law, or one of the weaknesses of the common law remedy, is that the police are not duty bound to attend or support the action. And indeed, if they did decide to attend, they could actually ask the enforcement agent to withdraw in order to avoid a breach of the peace. So in addition to possibly asking the trespasser to withdraw, they could physically ask us to withdraw as well, under the threat of arresting either the trespasser or actually the enforcement agent.
So the law with squatters, residential squatting is a criminal offence, and it should be dealt with by the police. Under section 144 of the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012. In 2012, squatting in a residential property was made a criminal offence. It can lead to 6 months in prison, a £5,000 fine, or even both. Just to make you aware that anyone who originally enters a property with the permission of a landlord is not classed as a squatter. For example, if someone is renting and falls behind with the rent, this will not be classed as squatting if they continue to live there.
Yeah, and on that point, Martin, we should also comment that there is a separate legal process for that to be followed for removing tenants who haven't actually paid for the rent, but we're not going to cover that today. So just emphasising the point on common law again with squatters. Squatters inevitably are occupying a property. So if you remember what I said on the last slide, we cannot use Hasbury's law or common law for the removal of squatters. So we've established now what can't be done under common law and its limitations. So let's have a quick look at the other remedy, which is a possession order. On the next few slides, we'll discuss that option.
So a writ of possession, this is usually the best option, although it can take a lot longer. So to get a writ of possession, it requires a county court order, which needs to be transferred up to the High Court. Once it's transferred to the High Court, this can only be enforced by a High Court enforcement officer. The HCEOs are granted more powers for removal, and under the Arrest Section 10 of the Criminal Law Act, we've got the power to arrest.
Yeah, picking that point up as well, I mean, it's right to say that the majority come through the county court, but there are exceptional circumstances as well where an application can be made directly to the High Court, but we'll pick that up at a later point just to sort of summarise the events or the situation where the application would be made directly to the High Court. I'm picking up on the increased powers that the High Court officer has under a writ of possession. Yes, this aspect of a power of arrest. Basically, where any resistance or intentionally obstructs a court officer in engaging and executing the process that has been issued by the High Court, that would make that individual guilty of the offence. And Section 10 then would allow the High Court officer to actually physically arrest that individual. It doesn't happen that often and only happens in extreme cases because it's not something that we particularly want to be doing, but it is a threat that we can use and have used historically. The other massive positive about having a writ or a warrant of possession is that the police are actually commanded to attend and support us. Under the Courts Act 2003, it states quite clearly that the constable's duty is to assist enforcement officers in the execution of a writ or a warrant. So in addition to us having our own powers of arrest, the police are actually commanded to support us in our actions as well.
So the majority of cases are heard in the county court, and most possession claims will be started either in the county court or, as I said earlier, through a possession claim online, or PCOL as we call it.
Yeah, and one quick point on that as well. There is a third option there, especially for local councils, that can actually start the action in the magistrate court as well.
Yeah, these there are some, as you say, exceptional cases that can be put straight through to the High Court for various reasons, which we'll go through later.
Okay, as part of the process, I've also put this on the individuals. This usually involves a letter which is posted to something quite prominent, and that would be a minimum of 7 days pre a hearing, and that would be part of the process in terms of the landowner asking for the illegal occupiers to remove themselves from that site, and actually giving them sufficient warning that if they do not remove themselves, then there will be a court hearing in X number of days. And the courts will actually look at this as part of our due process in terms of being reasonable with the illegal occupiers in asking them beforehand to remove themselves. Obviously, if they do not and the hearing progresses, then the next slide will show us the actual process that's involved with the paperwork. So
it's the transfer to the High Court trespass. So although it says simple process there, we've actually got Rachel from our court services department just to come in here and just explain briefly the process once it gets to the court stage. But to start things off is the CCJ. This is a process which is started, as I explained earlier, in the county court, or you can play online through a possession order online, which is PCOL. When an order for possession is granted at the county court, this can then be transferred to the High Court. Once we get it over in our transit department, and once we've obtained the possession order, we send this up to Liverpool. This is High Court Enforcement's transfer department, and all transfers are dealt there. Our transfer team will start the process of transferring it over to the High Court. This will be done by using an N2938 form. This is a standard combined certificate of judgment, but please note that a High Court officer must be named on this form. I'll just pass you over to Rachel now to explain the court process.
Hello. So, as Martin said, the transfer up team will deal with all the paperwork, and they will then send that to me, and I'm based in our London office, which is just a few hundred yards from the High Court. I will then take that paperwork before a master, which can be done the same day, if at all possible. If he is happy with the paperwork, the master will then grant the order to issue the writ, which is then sealed by their enforcement office. Being so close to the court does allow us to process the cases much more quickly than if we were to, say, post them into court, which was the old process. They can generally be turned around, within a matter of days.
So once we get the sealed writ back from court, that enables us to enforce the writ then.
Yeah, we've got enforcement on day 7. I mean, that's just a rough guide. It could be anywhere between day 4 and day 7. Although we'll have the paperwork at that point to actually continue with the enforcement, I think it's good to point out that it's not quite that simple, because if it is actually quite a big eviction, then we'd have to consider the police liaison, and we have to make sure that their diaries would actually fit in with our diaries before the actual enforcement itself would take place. But in principle, there's no reason why it couldn't take place between day 5 and day 7.
Yeah.
Okay, we mentioned earlier on about certain circumstances where an application would be made directly to the High Court. As you can see, these tend to be far more serious in nature. The first one is where there's a substantial risk of public disturbance, and it will be in the public's interest really to get it dealt with as a matter of urgency in order to avoid any serious harm to anybody. Another aspect would be complicated dispute of facts, where the case itself is very complicated, and some due consideration has got to be given to all particular aspects of the situation. And the other one, if it actually involves any important points of law, where the decision would need to be made in the High Court in any case. But as I said earlier on, these are few and far between in reality, and by far the majority come through the county court process. Okay, protesters. What issues do we have with protesters? What happens if protesters are not dealt with quickly? Well, as we've seen in the press this week with Quadrilla, they've had an opportunity to lock on, to cause delays, to get their cause publicised. That was dealt quite quickly. Historically, the longer they've been able to build blockades. They've been able to build small villages virtually, towers, whether it's built out of scaffolding or built out of wood. They've had opportunity to tunnel underground. Some quite tunnels have been uncovered by ourselves over the years. Again, all of these aspects are designed to delay and prolong any enforcement action. And the result of such delay, not only potentially is it a risk to life, both from the protesters aspect and also from the enforcement agents aspect, but also it's an added cost. The longer it takes to actually deliver the enforcement, then the more the cost, and they're fully aware of this, and they would see this as a success for their cause. The incumbents themselves can establish, it may start off as 1 or 2 tents that could expand to actually more rigid sheds being built. Linked with that, they would probably build themselves some toilets on site. And generally, the rubbish that would accumulate as the size of the encampment rises would result in a far bigger mess at the end of it following enforcement. So after they're gone, what are we faced with? waste, whether it's foods, whether it's tins, there's human waste on site, the building materials that they've used, any fencing material, other contaminated waste such as oil, gas, diesel. They may well have used old tyres as part of their construction. So all of these add up to being a cost ultimately for removal, because our task in actually enforcing could well include restoring the land to its original state. So in addition to that, I mean, what do they physically do on site in order to delay removal? We've got to remember the protesters are there for a reason. In the main is to get their cause or arguments heard in the media. It's also to stop or delay any work on a site or land. And it's quite surprising the lengths that they actually go to as individuals, and quite surprising that they actually have little regard for their own life in some situations. I mean, examples of this would be that they'll chain themselves to trees, property, to gates, to plant and machinery. We've had situations where they've been living up trees. They've developed quite complex cargo netting situations with interlinking trees so that they can pass from one little base to another. They've built big barricades to stop enforcement agents entering sites. All these protesters have got to be dealt with using reasonable force. And because of that, I mean, we've developed specialist teams under the National Eviction Team, which include IRATA 3 climbers. These are highly specialist climbing individuals who have vast experience in dealing with protesters, whether it's up trees, up buildings, or power stacks, or even scaffolding tripods. We've dealt with all sorts and manner of protest paraphernalia, but these guys are very specialized. In addition, we've got the tunneling team who are highly skilled in removing protesters from underground. And also, the most common form of protest would be sort of lock-on protests, where possibly they'd put a D-lock around their neck and tie themselves onto some plant or some machinery. And we've got lock-on specialists or removal specialists to deal with this. What must be considered, due to the very specialist nature of the teams, they must also have specialist insurance in place to cover the team for protester removal, because without that, we would be seriously exposed to any claim that may ensue.
Alan, I just wanted to ask you that, with these specialist teams, how quickly can we actually get them operational?
Again, depending on the situation, whether or not we needed to get the IRATA 3 climbers involved or whether we needed to get a tunneling team involved, generally I would say 5 to 7 days.
Right, okay.
Because quite often we do need to respond quite quickly to situations. We do have certain arrangements in place with certain clients in the form of a rapid response team, and which we guarantee, on that basis, we guarantee a response within 12 hours.
So you've got like a core team then ready to go.
We do have a core team, yes.
Excellent. That leaves us on to our first quiz. There's a lot of information to take on there, so now's the time to see if you're all paying attention. So you should see on your screen shortly, question number 1 is a multiple choice question, and the question is, what is the most common type of trespasser? Is it A, protesters, B, squatters, or C, travellers? And excellent, it looks like the vast majority of you were listening, with 80% of you going with the correct answer, which was travellers. Next question. Residential squatting is a criminal offence, true or false? And that was true, it is a criminal offence. Next question. The HCAO HCEO has powers of arrest under common law eviction. True or false? Ooh. This one's a lot tighter. Gents, what's the correct answer?
No, they don't.
Correct, it's false. Of which 60% of you were correct, 40% thought it was true. Question number 4. When are the police legally obliged to attend an eviction? Never. An eviction under Housebury's law, or an eviction under a writ of possession. Once again, vast majority of you were correct. It is an eviction under the writ of possession. And then the last question in this section, you see on your screens now, and that is, why can squatters not be removed without court order? Is it because squatters have greater rights than other trespassers? Is it because they reside in a fixed structure? Is it because the court order enables the police to support the removal process, or is it all of the above? %40 of you got the correct answer, and they reside under a fixed structure. Many of you said all of the above, but squatters definitely do not have more rights than other trespassers. We'll move swiftly on. I will take this time to remind you that now is probably a good time to start writing questions into the question box. So if you've got anything you're unsure about, you've heard already, now's the time to start writing out those questions, because we'll be visiting them later on. Moving swiftly on. Gentlemen.
Okay, the actual planning process, this is where I normally get involved, and is a very important part of the whole eviction process, because if you spend sufficient time at the start of it, that will ultimately determine how successful the operation will be at the end. So looking at the 3 different classes that we've identified, travellers, squatters and protesters, do we actually treat them differently? I think we do, because they have certain characteristics. If you think about travellers, their motivation of being on land is partly cultural, partly historical. It's definitely a lifestyle thing for them, but it also could be a commercial thing for them, because if they've got a lot of work around the corner, it may actually just suit them to be in a particular area. Squatters, on the other hand, the homeless people, I mean, some may choose it as a lifestyle, just to get a roof over their head. They may use it to avoid paying rents or taxes. But the protesters are definitely different, because their motivation is often political, whether that's strictly political or whether it's a combination of politics and environmental issues. And they would specifically target sort of infrastructure developments, whether it's roads, bypasses or railway tracks. And the other big target area for the environmental protesters would be any fuel extraction sites, whether it's gas, oil, coal, shale, etc. Under the political heading, we've got the anti-capitalists, the anarchists. If you cast your mind back a few years ago, the V for Vendetta masks were quite apparent in the London problems in 2011, and they sort of came to the forefront at that point. So in terms of the physical planning, what do we look at? What do we go through? How do we plan to avoid certain situations? Well, initially, a formal meeting with all stakeholders is absolutely key. They would be the client. They would also be the local police force or British Transport Police, as the case may be. And that's a very important aspect for us, because they can give us up-to-date intelligence and also advise us on what support they are going to give us on the actual day of the operation. And of course, that level of support will depend on what intelligence is gathered. We prepare risk assessments. Okay, what does that mean? Well, who's actually on the site? Is it a mixture of old and young people, or are they middle-aged people? Are there any dogs or livestock on the site? Are there any vulnerable adults on the site? We'd also have a look at the site itself. Is there contaminated waste there? Are there oils and fuels? Is there human waste there? Is there asbestos on site? Would they have, especially with protesters, would they have placed deliberate obstructions or traps for us? Would they have dug trenches, holes? Would they have inserted spikes in the land? Have they prepared missiles in the form of gas cylinders? Is there any evidence of any lock-ons on site? Are there any weapons on site, whether it's knives, swords, flare guns, or anything else of that nature that could cause us a problem? Again, it's something that we have to consider. The reputational management of the client is absolutely key in all of this. What does the client want out of it? A low-key, efficient operation, I suspect. And that's what we plan to deliver. Another consideration would be the management of personal items after the eviction. So what's physically going to happen to any items that's left on site? Is there going to be a policy where they allow 14 or 28 days to allow the individuals to collect their goods? Again, that's something that we can facilitate depending on what the client would want.
That reputational management, that's a really interesting point, actually, especially with all the PR that surrounds these protester sites. I suppose it's as important for us as a company as the actual landowner to make sure that we do protect the reputation of both parties.
Absolutely, and as part of that, we'd recommend that the client consider a news or PR liaison person to actually be a spokesman for any event or any eviction that would take place. Another aspect that we would need to define is the boundary of the land and premises that we have to take action on. As part of the writ, there'll be a plan attached with a very bold outline of the boundary where we are fully authorised to deal with the eviction. Absolutely key that we understand that we cannot do anything outside that boundary, because any action taken outside that boundary, we would have no authority whatsoever. So again, all this is pulled together into a operational plan. The risk assessment is quite an in-depth mitigation of how we would deal with particular aspects of any risk that would be identified. The HCE responsibility in all of this is absolutely key, because the HCE, or the officer who is named on the writ, he is the individual that is given all authority by the High Court to undertake this job. So ultimately, if something goes wrong, it's his responsibility. He has the power then to delegate to his team to act as his assistants, which he will then supervise. So it's definitely a process of delegation and not abdication, because he will be on the site making sure that everything is absolutely goes smoothly. We've got a list here of the HCE's responsibilities. I won't run through them all, but basically it's the common sense. And ultimately, what all this, when put all together, basically he has to make sure that the illegal occupiers are removed from the land and the land is handed back to its rightful owner in the condition that it would have been prior to occupation.
So as operations manager on these evictions, and from High Court's point of view, what's the main objective when the eviction actually takes place?
The main objective is to, as I just said, to clear the land and restore it back, or hand it back to the owner, free of any trespassers. The manner that it's done is also key as well, in that it needs to be done in an efficient timely manner, which generally means as quickly as possible, so that everybody can get on with their life, basically. So we'd consider it a job well done if there is zero publicity around the event. Moving on to the regulatory compliance, as you can imagine, dealing with such complex situations opens up a whole raft of different issues, different legal situations. We've got a list of a few of them here. The specialist teams I've already mentioned, and the training that goes into their skill set ticks all the boxes that we require. We've got to be very much aware of everybody's human rights. That's both the trespassers, the squatters, and also our own enforcement agents, to make sure that we comply with all the legislation around that. The risk management we've already covered off quite thoroughly on the hazard side of it. Something that we do as a matter of habit is when we deal with well, depending on the nature of the trespasser or the squatter, do we warn the occupants? I mean, this is often a debate that's taken place at the early days with a client in terms of whether they want to give a warning to the trespassers or protesters. From experience and from our perspective, I think it depends on the situation, but in general, we'd advise that for protesters specifically, we would not want to be giving them any advance warning of our entry date or the date of the operation. And that quite simply, based on experience, where we've had situations where possibly local authority has seen it as the right thing to do to advise the protesters, what it's done is enabled them to refortify their position. We've had a situation in London where they ended up having one massive rave party the night before we entered, which added to the problems the following day, because their numbers are swollen from 20 to probably 50 or 60 people in the building. And that was compounded by the fact that we had actually, or the client had decided to give notice. For squatters, alternatively, we try to work with them and yes, possibly give them some advice and give them a heads up on a date, because that may encourage them to move voluntarily. And the same for travellers. We have found that by talking to the travellers, they quite often will give us an indication of their timescales and their plans for moving on. And if we can use that, then we certainly will in an attempt to move things on to resolve issues sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Picking up on the training point, I'm not sure if the listeners are aware, but as an enforcement company, High Court Enforcement are quite unique in that we've got our own award-winning training department, which is Silex approved. David Grimes is our head of training and development, and he's been with the company for 24 years. He's got a vast amount of experience in the enforcement industry, and David's also a qualified teacher. Some of his workshops include vulnerability and mental health awareness, and also understanding violence and conflict management. And from 2019, in addition to his existing training modules, David will also cover a level 3 award in protester management and possession of land and property. This course will cover things like planning, preparation, trespass, and even CPOs. A full training guide is available on our company website.
Thanks, Martin. Just the next slide picks up on a few more regulatory compliance. I brushed on the use of force earlier on, just to put a bit more into that one. Excuse me. We do follow a very strict protocol when removing illegal occupiers on land. It tends to mirror the police 5-stage strategy, where we give them sufficient time and opportunity to remove themselves before it gets to the actual use of force stage. I mean, typically passive resistance would result in the individually being carried out by 4 enforcement officers. There'd be 1 on each leg and 1 on each arm. And, you know, we often see protesters who want to protest, but they are passive with it. That would result in them being carried off the land and put gently down outside the curtilage of the boundary. In a situation where there's aggressive resistance, Again, the 5-stage process will be followed. It will be recorded and videoed, both to protect the individual and to protect enforcement agents. And then proportional, it will be escalated at that stage to use of a proportional force to contain the individual. Mentioned earlier, linked to that is the power of arrest, where we would use that in an attempt to reason with the individual prior to physically controlling the situation, and again removing that individual off the site. Securing the site thereafter, again, that's much down to the client's desire. It's something that we can do, we can arrange, and again, the inventory of the abandoned property is something that we would look to do as a matter of course. The rest of the headings there, skipping through them quickly: post-eviction security, what happens after we fulfill our obligation in removing the illegal occupiers. Well, depending on the situation, we can keep the writ open for a short period of time. For example, if the land was due to be, if there's some work due to be taken on the land and the client wished us to stay on for a day or two, just to make sure that the plant and machinery could come on and they could commence their work without any interruption, we could stay on the site for a couple of days, or thereafter we could come back to ensure that everything was running smoothly before signing the writ off. Over and beyond that, if they wanted additional security on the site, that's something we could also arrange for the continued support for the client.
It's been a few years since I've done an eviction myself with High Court and the NET. But I wondered, do you still use evidence gatherers on the evictions?
On every eviction, we would use an evidence gatherer. That basically, whether it would be a separate enforcement agent with a video camera, or whether it would be a video cam around somebody's neck, both do get used on every job.
Yeah.
The purpose behind that is twofold. Initially it protects the enforcement agent. So if there is a claim of any unfair treatment, then it can be evidenced. But also it protects the illegal occupier as well, because if people are aware that they are being recorded, quite often it brings out a better behaviour, which actually works in our favour. Other matters which can lead to issues: contaminated sites. Well, I think there's been enough publicity about different contaminated sites over the years to confirm that this is an ongoing issue, whether it's within, it's outside the issue with a writ, but it's a big matter for the client to deal with. They have to deal with whatever's left after the protesters have left the site. Vulnerable people, Martin's just mentioned, all the enforcement agents have gone through quite a thorough series of courses and training, and one of them is a level 2 and a level 3 vulnerable persons course, which actually makes everybody aware of the seriousness of mental health issues and really what is needed to handle the situation in a professional manner. So we're quite proud of our training on this field. Moving forward, asbestos. Well, we know the issues are on asbestos. But a lot of these sites that we would deal with could well become, well, are actually building sites. So on that basis, certain CDM regulations have to be considered. And again, it's being aware of what the site and the risks associated to each site forms a major plan of the operational plan, and all these things will be considered up front. And I mentioned earlier on, the big thing for us is to make sure, and we do have appropriate specialist insurance in place to ensure that everybody is covered for protester removal and not rescue, as we have seen other firms providing. Post-eviction security, it's something that we do provide, again, depending on what the client needs and what his desires are. Ultimately, once we sign the writs off, then it's handed back to the client, and it's up to him then to make sure that the place is adequately secured, whether that's plant and machinery, the land, or buildings.
I suppose that's an even bigger issue after going through all the efforts to actually evict the protesters or trespassers, is actually stopping them getting back on the land. That's a really important part of our service as well.
Yes, very much so. Because once the writ is signed off, then that's the end of that writ. However, it's not quite as difficult to get back on the land, because you wouldn't have to go through the whole process again, because the client would then apply for a writ of restitution, and that would basically resurrect the initial writ.
Yeah.
And we'd be able to re-enter the land pretty quickly once that was achieved. But yes, making sure that they can continue working on the land is absolutely key.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end. So we have one more quiz for you guys. Again, this is the last chance to ask any questions you may have. But let's get cracking on the quiz. There's 4 questions for you this time round. They'll be coming up on your screen now. So the first one is, which of the below is not under the HCO's responsibility during eviction? To undertake initial site assessment, management of protest activities, to ensure all occupiers are removed with whatever force necessary, or to maintain reputational care and management standards. And interestingly, only 30% of you got this correct, and that was to ensure all occupiers are removed with whatever force necessary. That is not one of the HCO's responsibility, because we use the terms whatever force necessary. It is using reasonable force. Next question. A writ of possession can only be executed once. If the person is unknown in return, you will need another writ. True or false? And the vast majority of you were correct. The answer is true. Question number 3. What needs to be considered post-eviction? Security, clean-up, changing of the locks, or all of the above? And 93% of you were correct with all of the above. And then final question, and this is the most important question you'll have to answer today. If you have a problem with squatters, trespassers, or activists, who are you going to call? Ghostbusters, the police, a security firm, or your dear beloved high court enforcement group? Yeah, Ghostbusters is far more popular than it should be. But yeah, no, Ghostbusters aren't going to help you get rid of squatters, I'm afraid. Bro, we'll now move on to some questions that have been asked. I'll hand over to you two gents.
Okay, I'll pick a selection of the questions. The first question, if you have a county court order, can you use your own bailiffs, or do they have to be county court bailiffs? Okay, again, depending on the context of this question, I'll use it in the context of there being trespassers on land. You can use county court bailiffs, that's not a problem. just got to bear in mind the pressures and time restraints that county court bailiffs are under. Depending on what part of the country you're at, it may take you 3 weeks, it could take you 6 weeks to get them onto a specific task. What they will not have is that they will not have a High Court order or a writ of possession from the High Court, a sealed order. So the process at that point would be, if you wanted to speed or expedite the eviction, you would get the county court order moved up to the High Court. At that point, you would use a High Court officer's name who has to be put onto the writ of possession. So a specific name would have to be put on the writ, and then we would be actually enforcing that writ. So to answer the question, initially you could use a county court bailiffs if that's what you wanted to do. Time constraints, and you would not have the power of the High Court writ either.
Picking up on that question there, I did a presentation in Cardiff yesterday, and we went through some figures for county court bailiffs. The national average for a county court bailiff from start to finish to actually carry out an eviction, this is a national average, was 40 weeks. It may be different in some areas, but that was the average for the county court bailiffs to perform an eviction.
So I guess the point to pick up on that, it would be in that 40 weeks, bearing in mind the escalation of what the trespassers could do in terms of damage and complicating the site or contaminating the site. In fact, that leads me on to another question, which asks, what do sites get contaminated with? I mean, depending on who they are, I mean, we've seen travellers take over a site where they've had work around the corner and subsequently ended up dumping hundreds of tons of mixed rubble on that land. That mixed rubble would include asbestos, plasterboard, plastics, and anybody involved in the construction industry would understand that these items need to be separated and disposed of separately. The net cost of clearing that site led into tens of thousands of pounds, and that was a real life case last year. So other waste on top of that would be human waste, empty gas cylinders, fuel that's left lying around, old tires, basically anything that would contaminate it could be left there. And the last question I'll pick up on is, if protesters were removed under the High Court process and they returned to an adjoining site, what happens? If you remember, I mentioned that under a writ of possession, attached to that would be a plan, and there would be a very clear boundary marked on that plan, which would actually give us that authority to actually deal with that area. If anything was outside that area, then unfortunately the process would have to start again.
Have we got any more? Grand. I think that will bring us nicely to an end. I'll thank the two gentlemen, Martin and Alan, for joining us today. We do have, these will be emailed out to you. We will send out the CPD certificate, we'll send out a copy of recording, we'll send out any other information. So if you want to get in contact with us, feel free to do so at a later point. If you have any questions, please don't be scared to get in touch. We are here to help. We are more than happy to help. We also have free ebooks available online, or you can ask them via email. And yeah, thank you very much for taking part today. Alan's details are there on screen for you. It's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much for listening.
Cheers, guys. Take it easy.